Okay, we'll start going right away. Um, so we'd like to welcome Lina Dencik to ENS. So we're well over halfway through ENS at this stage. So thanks for everybody coming along today. I know some people had ENS this week, so the BSA this week. So it's and sorry about our messing on scheduling it earlier in the month. So, but we've a really interesting conversation ahead of us. Lina runs the Data Justice Laboratory. She's an ERC scholar on this kind of crossover emergent field that has really established itself very, very quickly and become something I think that touches on an awful lot of our disciplines. So really interested in this conversation. Just to remind you that next next Tuesday, we have Evelyn Brodkin, Mary Murphy and Joe Whelan talking about street level welfare. So we're kind of traveling through the welfare eastas at the moment before we circle back out into broader issues towards the end of ENS. So I'll hand it over to Lina and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this. For me, I think this will be interesting because it is obviously an extremely interdisciplinary area that I'm working on, but also don't often get to speak, I think, with people that come from very different disciplines to this topic around welfare, and particularly the welfare state. So for me, that's really useful. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen and take you through what I'm going to do. So here, so what I'll do in this first, just introduce the topic a bit, is to, I guess, position myself within this area first of all, and just to explain a little bit how I come to this question, because I'm not a social policy scholar or an economist or a sociologist, but my background is I work in a media studies department, and I do come to this topic within the field of, I guess, critical data studies, as it's often called, or critical algorithm studies, that sort of is interested in thinking about the societal implications of some of these developments we're seeing in the collection and use of data. So as a sort of way of just introducing this topic, I wanted also just to, I guess, outline the broader framework within which I operate, which is this notion around data justice as well. So essentially this idea around data justice emerges out of what we've seen in terms of the developments and uses in data-driven systems, as we like to call it, or in basically algorithmically processing data, often to inform decision-making. And that's being used across various different aspects of society, and increasingly has an impact on people's ability to participate in society, whether that's in their ability to cross borders, or in their ability, or how they're hired or assessed within a job, or indeed in terms of benefits and welfare as well. And so it's this kind of broader framework around the datafied society that sort of piqued our interest also in setting up the Data Justice Lab, because what we were interested in is thinking about, well, what does that mean for how we then think about, questions around participation in society, and especially think about social justice. What does it mean for how we think about social justice? And so data justice kind of emerges out of these kind of broader developments that we see happening. And in particular, I guess, it's a challenge to thinking about what is at stake. So just to get a sort of definition of data justice insofar as there is one, we can think about data justice as a concept that's really used to denote analysis of data that pays particular attention to structural inequality, highlighting the unevenness of implications and experiences of data across different groups and communities in society. That's broadly, I guess, how this notion has taken on by others as well, who are interested in these kinds of questions. And it's a way of thinking about what is at stake, I guess, in different ways than, or in sort of new or emerging ways, about what is at stake with datafication. So the use of data, the collection and use of data particularly for decision making across areas of social life. And initially, I think, the collection of data, the use of data was bound up with questions around surveillance and privacy in particular, that what's at stake is perhaps increased efficiency and security, but what the price we pay is our individual privacy and increased surveillance in society. That came out, I think, very much also after the Snowden leaks revealed the extent to which our digital technologies are now data infrastructures, really, that are being used also by state actors as well as corporations to inform governance, to inform decision-making. But I think we've moved on from that, really, and increasingly we've seen a host of other issues being introduced that makes us think differently about what is at stake with datafication. And these have really emphasized, for example, the extent to which data processes are contingent on existing inequalities in society. So often the impact of the use of data will also have unequal impact, will impact different groups in different ways. Basically challenging the notion of, for example, mass surveillance, which seems to suggest that we're all sort of equally implicated in the datafied society, whereas actually the reasons we're monitored, what we're monitored for, but also how that comes back to impact our lives will be very different across different groups and communities. And there's been a lot of literature, I think, trying to highlight that. Also that it has implications for democratic processes. So questions around accountability and this idea of the black box society, that it challenges ways in which we might understand or can interrogate decisions and governance processes also as we come to rely on these technologies in different areas. But also that, this idea of, right, we are data, for example, the Don Cheney-Lippold book talks about algorithmic identity and the idea that increasingly we're also recognized. So who we are and what we're seen to be in the future is understood in terms of the data that's collected about us. So what does that mean for how we're recognized in society? And these are, I would guess, we can think of as sort of social justice questions in many ways, or certainly raises concerns about social justice issues to do with equality, to do with discrimination, to do with recognition and democracy more broadly. But the way in which that's been approached overwhelmingly, I guess, has been in, quite sort of narrow parameters in the sense that often that has been translated, certainly from a policy perspective, into thinking about implications for individual human rights, so our individual right to freedom, to privacy, or to non-discrimination. Those kinds of areas have been discussed a lot. And that often then means that there's a call for sort of procedural safeguards to be incorporated into the use of data to do with sort of impact assessments or trying to have sort of privacy or fairness by design. And also we have a kind of an industry around data ethics now that's been very powerful, that has advocated for things like increased training of engineers to make them consider ethical issues more, perhaps create codes for engineers or even for different bodies that are using technology that they need to follow. And often that's advocated by industry itself that develop these technologies that we need more ethics, etc. But I think this kind of approach of this understanding of what's at stake and the response to what's at stake through these kinds of emphasis on individual rights and on ethics, etc., have also been accused of neutralizing or depoliticizing the challenges of what is actually at stake with datafication. And I guess in my paper on the datafied welfare state, I want to take on that a little bit and think about, well, are there broader things here we need to reckon with to do with, for example, the ideological implications of using data in various different areas of public and social life, and indeed the political economy questions that come with that as well. So that's, I guess, what I try and I want to address when thinking about what happens to the welfare state as it becomes increasingly dependent on the provision of data-driven systems in different areas. And so our work that we've looked at, looking at welfare in particular, falls under that kind of, I suppose, in that, or is situated within that context, where I should say, the universal credit is often taken as a prime example of the first of digital by default policy. That wasn't actually the one that we looked at or investigated in our work. We were interested more in this idea of using data for predictive analytics in order to assess various risks and needs of citizens that are being taken up by different, we see increasing growth of those kind of risk assessment tools and other types of predictive analytics in different councils and local authorities. that are seen to allow councils and local authorities to target resources better, and also to increasingly do what they call or engage in forms of sort of targeted interventions, which are often sort of preemptive forms of intervention in questions around social welfare. And these are also, we looked at also beyond the welfare sector, we also looked at things like that in policing, where it's also increasingly used to try and predict likely reoffenders, for example, who might be likely to reoffend in the future. So that's the sort of phenomenon that we looked at with my colleagues at the Data Justice Lab, that we've also written about. But in the chapter on the datafied welfare state, I want to try and think about what it means in these broader terms around ideology and political economy. And so that's where this notion of datafication as responsibilization comes from in the first instance, which is to try and think about what does it mean to use these tools that are essentially optimized for risk capture. So these are tools that are often designed to capture risk in some form. And I wanted to draw on, in critical data studies, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that once we start relying on these data-driven systems for understanding the social world, there are particular epistemological and ontological assumptions in doing so. So Van Dijk talks about dataism as the ideological component of datafication, where she says that, this rests on an idea about a certain relationship between people and data that somehow should allow us to make predictions about individuals based on group traits. So based on data about people that are like you, that should tell us something about what a person might be or what a person might do in the future. And also Mark Anderovich has talked about it in terms of operationalism, meaning that there's an assumption that if we collect enough data, we don't need to invoke forms of interpretation or narrative. We can operationalize decision-making. It sort of removes the politics of decision-making, that those assumptions are sort of embedded in this use of datafication. And the way that these sort of technologies work, I think, has implications then also for practices. In one sense, they embed a kind of conditionality in the sense that access to services is conditional on particular forms of data being available, but also that they need to, they need to, not just that the data needs to be available, but also that the data needs to say something particular about them in order to, for them to access services. But also that these systems understand risk as attached to risk factors as attached to individual characteristics and behaviors. So this is very much a sort of personalization of risk, if you like, that's what these systems are able to capture. And there has been a concern there that therefore it leads to sort of an individualization of social issues in which policy focuses then on these types of preemptive measures that are about engaging with individual families and households. And these technologies are not conducive to understanding complex social issues that to do with, for example, poverty or racism in society that can't be captured through these kinds of datafied systems. So I think that's one part of it. And then the other part is more the kind of political economy question. That I think it's really important to think about what it means when we start the provision where public sector bodies are provided with these kinds of technologies, because these are not one-off sort of shrink software. It's not just a program that you purchase. These are often modeled on a business model that's called software as a service. So the sense is that you're locked into a long-term transaction in which the aim often is for these providers is to sort of scale up their services so that more and more activity happens on their platforms. And this, I think, is important if we start, if you draw on some literature that's tried to make sense of the sort of political economy that we see emerging with datafication, which sort of treats, so for example, data as capital, and therefore understands data also as a form of rent, really, that is extracted when we start relying on different platforms for different types of services. And in that sense, it's as we're locked into these kind of long-term transactions based on that political economy, we start seeing a growth of sort of dependency, and I've talked about it as a sort of a tenancy type dependency. There are others who've written about this kind of landlord type way of thinking about platforms. And as also more and more of our practices come onto these platforms, what happens then to existing public infrastructure, I think is a key question. Does it, the extent to which it starts displacing existing public infrastructure, existing forms of knowledge, existing forms of expertise, as we become dependent on these platforms. And I draw us here on work by Seda Gerses, Martha Poon, and Dub, who talk about that as sort of programmable infrastructures, this vision of replacing or displacing public infrastructure with computational infrastructure, and the kinds of consequences that might have also for democracy, but also in terms of welfare. For example, how we think about welfare, how we think about how social issues are defined and resolved. So those are kind of broader implications, I think, that we need to think about with the turn to data systems in the welfare state. So I'll end there. I think it was almost 15 minutes exactly.
Wow, okay. Thanks a million. That was a fantastic kind of whistle stop tour through. I feel a bit kind of drunk from the speed of it, the amount of material kind of coming at me. Like one of the things that really strikes me is how new this field is and how people are grappling to make sense of it. To make sense of practice that is kind of like flourishing everywhere, and that we're in the social sciences somewhat ill-equipped to deal with this rapid kind of growth of data and its uses. And there's so many places to go with this. If anybody wants to put up their hands, ask a question in the chat, or put on their mic. I think we could talk about any one of those elements of your presentation for our full time together. Like myself, I'm particularly interested in this idea of digital by default. As you know, in COVID, we're experiencing this rapid kind of everything has been digitized so quickly in a kind of emergency setting, without much thought for inclusion, who's left behind, but also there's kind of obvious blind spots, if that isn't an oxymoron, of digital inclusion, but it's the more subtle pervasive ones that are very difficult to detect that I think is interesting. We could talk about predictive analysis, responsibilization, renterism. So I'll kind of drum up business for chat, but I might start with a question. Oh, well, I'll take a question first, and then. So the first kind of question, and it isn't something you particularly address, but I've seen it in your work, is the gap between the person and their data, and that kind of transformation in which we pour ourselves into data. You know, like in all this talk about data, I haven't found anybody who's really captured that from a kind of micro-sociological perspective. And I wonder if you'd kind of comment on, like, we've all this kind of like zeitgeist. And then when you actually look at the systems, it's your gender, it's your age, it's your postcode, you know, when people become their data.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in my field, it gets discussed a lot about, so Haggerty has this term called data double. Okay, and now I can't see you. Okay, I can see you. I have to go down. Where they talk about the sort of a data double and this assumption that somehow we can be, our sort of lived experiences can be captured through this kind of algorithmic identity. I guess that's also the sort of Cheney-Lippold idea. But the critique around that is that this will be an inevitably very reductionist understanding of any person's lived experiences, in part because these systems do rely on information or knowledge that can be quantified, and essentially, you know, does that capture who we are, you know, if it only is composed of what can be turned into a data point. Now, of course, at the same time that there is a huge industry emerging that tries to say that they can go beyond the kind of data that you're talking about, this sort of personal data in that sense, and that they actually, you can capture someone from facial expressions or from other types of physiological kind of aspects, that somehow also there's a huge industry around emotional AI emerging that somehow that sort of claims to be able to use micro expressions on your face, etc., and other areas, various things like that, in order to say how you feel or who you are as a person. These kind of persona-centric analyses are emerging. Now, they are based on quite limited scientific validation that is actually possible, but that doesn't mean that their existence as an industry isn't real or doesn't have real implications. So I think it is something we have to reckon with, and also maybe push back on this idea that we can be captured in a data double, that actually that is not true. And so when systems like this are used to make decisions about people, that needs to be recognized from the outset, that whatever you get from these systems is going to be a very reductionist understanding of somebody's lived experiences. So therefore, you need to treat or engage with these technologies on that premise. So I think there is, I think there is work around it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'm not sure people are engaging with it quite on that, on just how limited it is. But there's been quite a few questions, and I wasn't fully paying attention on order. So, so we might, if I go, Antoinette, Michael, Rebecca, and Tom.
I think Tom was first, but I can go ahead.
He's always first.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I really enjoyed your paper. I loved all the different examples, and it was just getting, more and more where is this going, and all the different fields that this is covering. I suppose it's more of a next step. Have you come across resistance to the technologies, maybe from, so you mentioned policing, child welfare, the pandemic, credit ratings. There's a lot of administrators, and you mentioned the citizen scoring as well, and the universal credit, obviously. There's a lot of administrators and, institutional staff now being asked to use these technologies. I'm just wondering, have you looked at their reaction to the introduction of the technologies?
Yeah, great. So this is actually something that also my colleague Jana Redden has looked at as well, who's looked at cancelled systems and why do they become cancels. And in some cases, it would be also because of a pushback from frontline staff administrators who do not either sort of maybe either from a sort of ethical point of view do not think this is an appropriate thing to be doing, but also because they don't work very well. That's actually often the case too, right? That actually they have huge error rates, etc., which in the citizen scoring report that we did, we discussed some of that. A lot of that has to do with data quality issues as well. So it's sort of premised on problematic processes that predate, I guess, the introduction of these systems. But I also know that there have been cases in Sweden, for example, where social workers have actually gone on strike with the introduction of new eligibility systems that are meant to measure eligibility through automated processes. So I know that there has been resistance to it, but I think one of the things, and this perhaps also speaks to Ray's point about we don't actually know very much about how it is changing practices, and that's important because that kind of impact assessment of changing practices, does it change how resources are allocated? Does it change how someone makes decisions about how they might engage with someone? Isn't there and isn't being carried out by anybody. As far we asked, within councils and local authorities, if they were measuring those kinds of things, are they actually assessing the extent to which this is changing work practices? And they're not. Maybe not because they don't want to. It might be a resource question or other things, but also they asked us, how would you do that? Right? How do you do that? So I think it's also a methodological question that needs to be addressed there.
Okay, thanks. They hadn't even considered it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And yeah, and we've no cases like the Austrian PES ditching its system because a caseworker kind of revolt, and I think something similar to the Swedish happened in Finland as well. On their profiling algorithm. So sorry, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. That was fantastic. I'm going to take a lot from that. I love that idea, not the idea, but the way you described it, the displacement of public infrastructure by computational infrastructure is a really nice phrase, particularly in the kind of activation and welfare space. Maybe to play devil's advocate a bit, obviously you talked about the personalization and risk, and it calls into mind the kind of risk profiling that's always been a feature of the welfare state. Basically on how we kind of target services and triage and so forth. Some might see this personalization of risk that AI profiling enables in particular as in some way being fairer and less stigmatizing than the kind of dumb profiling systems we've had in the past. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. The reason being that in theory or supposedly, and probably very different in practice, we're not profiling people on the basis of kind of ascribed identities or group associations that we're kind of estimating risks, so, and basically making them vulnerable to statistical discrimination on the basis of group identities. It's more refined than that. We're discriminating on the basis of perhaps their past previous behaviors that we have a lot more data about. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, so the extent to which, I think it's a good question, the extent to which AI is fundamentally different than the type of statistical discrimination that I guess you're pointing to has been a problem previously, I think needs to be debated in the sense that AI systems rely on existing historical data that's available. So actually often we might see it as a form of extreme stereotyping too, right? So that it is based on what other people like you in whatever way you might define who people like you are, what they have done in the past will sort of inform how you know, administrators should engage with you as a person. So I think that issue still remains, and I think it's discussed a lot in the sort of fairness by design, sort of how you mitigate against that. Now, but I do think it's a fair point about the sort of the extent to which, you know, so I get challenged a lot with the fact that, well, human decision-making is biased and unfair. So, you know, of course, is this not just a little bit less biased and a little bit less unfair because it removes that, you know, sort of other forms of bias, etc., from the equation. But I do think it needs to be thought about the extent, and I guess that's where this kind of ideological component, that it still entails understanding social knowledge in a particular way. It's still about privileging certain type of information that can be quantified as the way in which we should understand the social world and people's experiences. So we might say that, you know, we have bias in human decision making, so what does it matter we have bias in this form of decision making? But I think that doesn't capture well. It's also a fundamentally different way of making decisions, and that needs to be talked about more, I think. Not just this issue of bias, but actually it's a very different way. It doesn't replicate human decision making. It's a fundamentally different way of making judgments about something, and that I think needs to be talked about. The other thing I also just wanted to say is that, and this is about, I guess, the kind of social and political context in which these technologies are being implemented, which is about showing action on, for example, issues around efficiency and being more efficient in terms of how you allocate resources. And so, you know, the reason for the introduction of many of these systems when we spoke to councils and local authorities was austerity, right? And so cuts. And so this is a way to be seen to be more efficient with fewer resources. That also means that you're sort of introducing these kinds of systems designed to capture risk in a context of service reduction. And so there has to be some kind of question about then, well, what do you do then? It doesn't actually maybe address the issues that are being claimed to be addressed, because all it will do, I guess, is sort of illustrate where risk might happen based on these kinds of analyses, but not necessarily increase service or actually address the social issues at hand. And so I guess the worry is the extent to which these technologies tend to serve as a kind of cover for actually having to do other type of interventions. Right. Yeah. I think it's otherwise a fair point about the question about the sort of extent of bias in existing practices.
Yeah, and I think there's an imaginary element to what these AI systems as well. Like they are the kind of techno-utopian vision that of this automated straight through processing, but they require a huge amount of manual processing to hold them up, which I think is often quite missed. Sorry, I think we lost Rebecca, but I think she's back now. So Rebecca?
Yes, yes. Sorry, indeed, I was gone for a second. I hope the question previously, I think, sounded like it went into the direction. I do apologize if I'm repeating something. Really interesting what you were saying, and what you were sort of mentioning as questions about reductionist understanding and just now about bias. I wonder if you were able to sort of maybe think ahead and think about the wider social contract and how that might be shaped, influenced in any way by this datafication.
Oh, I think you're on mute now.
Yeah, no, that was my question. So if you were able to think about the wider social contract, sorry.
Yeah. I guess the way that we've approached that is a bit about, and I don't know if this speaks to your question, but what happens to sort of state-citizen relations, I guess. And I think that's, so in part, I guess, we try and think about that in terms of this question of conditionality and how that becomes embedded in how we think about access to services. So does it limit those kinds of, the idea of universal access, for example, which I'm not saying, by the way, I also think it's important to sort of say that those issues weren't introduced or didn't just happen because of technology or datafication. I'm aware that has been an issue for a long time in thinking about the welfare state. But I think there are also questions about these, that's and then the political economy question about these actors that then enter into this space, who they are. And this is an accountability question in part in terms of who is responsible for the kind of expertise that we then come to rely on, and therefore how are citizens able to actually feel that they are involved in this process. So the social relations within datafication are fundamentally overwhelmingly extractive. It's not consent is kind of meaningless in these contexts because it's about getting access to services, and so often that overrides this idea around that, well, people have given consent to data being collected and used about them, etc., when there isn't really an option. So I think the fact that these actors come into this space and extract data in this way sort of introduces, I think, a complication to this idea of the social contract, definitely, and the sort of the democratic implications that has that we need to contend with. That's not really answered your question very well, but I guess I'll need to sort of think about other ways. I'm just thinking about, because I know that sort of Zuboff has written about the social contract in this respect in terms of surveillance capitalism, and very much wants to sort of emphasize this idea that we are sort of fodder for these machines to operate, and we become rendered as sort of raw material essentially. And I think that is in part kind of a useful way to think about it, but I also think we need to kind of think about also this idea of what happens to policy and democratic decision making beyond that. But I haven't articulated that yet. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think if I can think of another way of framing it, but not right now.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody has articulated it properly, what this is kind of, and again, it's that idea that practice is moving so quickly.
Yeah.
And what it does to, like I suppose Tom and myself in our work, we're looking at how people are subjectified through that process of datafying themselves. And that is the starting point to a greater subjectification in our case of accepting the condition of being unemployed and taking on the identity, that is done through the performance and gestures of data.
Yeah.
But we're struggling to kind of get hold of what that process is. I don't know. And it just as you were talking, it struck me like the issue of bias as this, like it's always an ameliorating activity of engineering out bias, and it doesn't address the real conditions of distinction that are made in datafication processes that are, like the overall infrastructure is never in question. It's always something that's been tinkered with and modified at a lower level. Sorry, I'm prattling on, and I should let Tom, and then we have Zach and Pat.
So I thought of another question since the start. So maybe, but you can come back to it because it's a crazy one for the end, maybe. But I mean, on this very issue that Ray is raising there. I mean, on subjectification and the way that is not just a perhaps potential infringement of human rights, but a transformation of the social and transformation of subjects. Is there any sense in your research that the process is beginning to transform the data or the objects which it observes, or which it measures or modifies, in the same way as people deliberately cultivate and protect their credit rating by making sure people have become aware of credit rating and therefore they adjust their behavior? Is there potential for, or already emergent, any way in which people become aware of their datification and respond to that in particular kind of ways? And then what does that do? Should that be called resistance, or should it be called the internalization of the perspective of the governors by the governed? It's sort of maybe just what Ray said, but
yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think we do see that. I've written about that as in terms of surveillance realism, I've described it, which was based on work that I did actually in the aftermath of the Snowden leaks with focus groups with people across the UK, where there was a sense in which actually we saw very much this internalization of the justifications for surveillance as well, and this idea also very much that there isn't a kind of resignation, there isn't much we can do about it, so kind of a disempowerment. But the way in which people then negotiate that is through these kind of micro forms of resistance, if you like, so little things that they try and do to sort of protect, for example, in this case, very much framed around their privacy. But I think we see it also perhaps in other ways in which we might, so I know of other people's work. So there's something I was reading about public administrators in Portugal who were introduced with a new risk assessment tool and understood very quickly that if they add certain type of information into it, then it will lead to certain responses. And actually then in some ways you can call it gaming gets used, right? Game the system in order to get the outcomes that they knew were beneficial for the people that they were working with, for their clients, because the system wouldn't necessarily, or the model wouldn't necessarily respond to that or correspond to what they thought should be the action taken. So you see it negotiated in that way. I've seen, right, in terms of sort of subjects themselves, the extent to which I haven't done any research on that, but I think that would be, I would imagine that sort of stuff happens simply based on the stuff that I've done previously that illustrates that people are quite aware of and do internalize the way in which they think their data double looks, right? Like, so they sort of have a sense in which they want to try and shape that. Of course, we also have an industry based around trying to manage your data double, right? So Experian, for example, we can, run advertisements on that basis. Let us take care of your data double, right? So that you can get a good credit score. So I think this is something that increasingly probably will become part of the negotiation. And then it's this sort of back and forth about systems having to account for the fact that people might potentially game it, etc. We see this also, another example is in the gig economy with platform workers who also try and game how they're algorithmically managed in order to create price surges or other ways in which they try and manipulate the platform. So that negotiation, I think, happens quite a lot. Now, what it means for how we understand ourselves and then how we go about things, I think is a big question that needs to be explored, and a really difficult one, because we might say that all social processes shape how we go about things. So, in what way is this unique? I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a really kind of, that performativity issue and the recursiveness of our data. I saw Adrienne turned on her camera and put her hand up for a question. I know her work probably would intervene nicely into this space, so I might skip ahead to you and we'll go back to Pat and Zach in a minute.
Oh dear, I actually had a very broad question. I let you down, Ray, sorry. I actually just, I guess broadly speaking, at this sort of state of affairs of the world, I was sort of wondering, if you could broadly kind of talk about what is the current state of the datification of the welfare world? Like, would there be examples of winners and losers in this system, or, just sort of curious about that.
So you mean in terms of just to make sure maybe I understand, you mean in terms of winners and losers of,
like maybe on a national level, or a city or a council that's implemented some of these things and maybe it's worked really well, or, you know, or like the far spectrum of the Chinese social credit system, you know, kind of where do we see?
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, in some ways it's very hard to say what the state of affairs is, because one of the problems with studying this is just the opacity that surrounds it. It's actually extremely difficult to find out what is going on for all kinds of reasons. I just want to sort of mention, I mean, we did to try and find out this stuff around our interviews with local authorities and councils. We did freedom of information requests to all councils and local authorities across the UK to ask them about their uses of data systems defined in different ways, and found that was not very easy to get information about, in part because actually in often cases, councils aren't aware of what's being used particularly, and that might be a kind of a definitional issue, or a lack of a common understanding of what it entails and what sort of predictive analytics means and algorithmic decision making means. We don't have a common or shared understanding of that. So actually finding out what different local authorities and councils are doing on that basis is very difficult. In other cases, it's because of commercial sensitivity. So they're using providers and they don't want to reveal information about that, but also because, for example, with things like benefit fraud, worried about if we reveal information about that, then people will start gaming the system, right, in this way. So there are all kinds of reasons why it's very difficult to actually get a sense of what the state of affairs are. But I will say what we found is that there are very different opinions about what it's appropriate to do with data across different local authorities and councils. So we don't have homogeneous practices happening. There are very heterogeneous practices happening and very different understandings of it. So it's only some councils and authorities that do this kind of predictive analytics aspect. I think that that's a good idea. But I will say also another difference is whether it's developed in-house or if they're using third-party providers. So we looked at Bristol, for example, where I live, where they have developed a system in-house in child welfare for predictive analytics and child welfare. That makes a huge difference from a research perspective, because it means you can ask far more questions about how the system works. It also meant they were actually far more following on from the research that we did. They sort of got in touch to ask if we could have some sort of discussions about issues that we'd raised in the report that we wrote about it. So much more sort of negotiation to try and do that, because they had control over the system. That isn't the case necessarily when there is a private provider being brought in, where it's much harder to have that kind of conversation. So I think they're good practices, you know, in that respect, in terms of how it's handled, in terms of the transparency around it, in terms of the ability to intervene. But in terms of kind of success stories, I think it's difficult to sort of pinpoint in that way, because I guess it is. I also don't know that I have, I mean, I'm, as I say, don't come from social policies. I don't know what success would mean and how that's defined. So I don't know if I can say what is a success story and what's a failure here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happens when you ask critical scholars what works. But thanks, Adrian. Sorry, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Hi, Lina. That was fantastic. So thanks a lot. And I read one of your papers yesterday and the other one then, and both of them again this morning. And they're just super, super, super interesting. Thoroughly enjoyed them both. I kind of have two questions, but I won't be cheeky and ask both of them. I'll ask the first one, and then if I have time at the end, I'll ask another one. So like COVID-19 just seems like the perfect time for datification, and particularly like to turn to digital by default. Like, you know, it's a time when surveillance seems like a good thing, you know, with contact tracing and all these things. Everything is digital. You know, we're working digitally, we're socializing digitally. I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about what you found, how it's affecting, you know, and particularly, is it affecting the move towards digital by default?
Yeah, I think, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. In many ways, if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, it's a story of success through crisis, right? I mean, this is kind of, they managed to, Silicon Valley sort of has manifested itself as this powerhouse through the 2008 financial crisis, as sort of capital shifted away from Wall Street into Silicon Valley, and really kind of just so much investment, which is why they don't need to make a profit even, right, for a very long time, because there's so much venture capital into that. But I think what we see with COVID is also that they have been, I mean, if we want to talk about winners and losers, big tech has obviously been huge winners, if you like. They, you know, Amazon's profits, I think, increased by something like 200% over the last year. So, you know, this obviously they have massively profited from this crisis. But in terms of what we see as well, I think, is this idea that you know, it's the state in collaboration, in partnership with the big tech, that's going to be the solution to social ills. I think we see that happening across different areas. So we see it, I think, in my own institute, you know, in higher education, it's very clear that we should be asking questions about how it is that we decided to, for example, turn to Zoom as the immediate answer to delivering or continuing in higher education, both in terms of research, but also in terms of conference. Instead of investing in public infrastructure, for example, we might say, why don't we invest in platforms that are actually come out of public infrastructure, where there is that adhere to the values of education. That as an alternative, for example, but that's not been the reaction. The reaction has been to create public-private partnerships, and you see that in the UK. You very much see it in Europe now as well. Where I will say also that, you know, involved a bit in stuff around, I guess because of my ERC grant as well, this sort of within the European Commission and policy processes there. And it's very clear that the aim is to create a data market to compete with the US and China, and for there to be an industrial policy around AI, where there will be a European alternative. And that industrial policy is very much through public-private partnerships. That's how that's being pushed through. So I think we will see this kind of technology companies playing a role in more and more aspects of public life. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic.
Of course, in that, technology companies only ever really have a temporary advantage, and it is like they all are burning platforms, and so there is hope for resistance and open source, and like ways of kind of, once these stabilize, they tend to become kind of assaulted as well. Which I think is kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, but I guess because, you know, the issue is sort of network effects as well there, because they might be assaulted insofar as we see a sort of backlash, some might say, against big platforms, you know, but we don't see many alternatives to them. So we have that kind of difficulty, I guess, because I think, you know, because of the political economy of platforms and the way that they're able to control markets. So it's difficult in that sense, but it's true, I think. I mean, that is, you know, the kind of European EU sort of policy debates around this is to try and say, well, we'll create alternatives that adhere to what they describe as European values, which is a sort of problematic phrase, I think, but one in which I guess speaks to some of this idea that it will be an alternative to surveillance capitalism of the US, an alternative to sort of authoritarianism of China, and Europe will be something else, and a different kind of market for technology companies, and different conditions that technology companies had to adhere to in order to operate within Europe.
Yeah. Well, but you know, without specifying what that might be, it just floats out.
Well, there's some apparently an assumed understanding of what European values means, which I find curious at best. Yeah.
Yeah. I found that in writing my own H2020, that section was a very drifty kind of space. Sorry, Zach, your question.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that talk. It was really, really excellent. I was actually also going to ask a question about the social contract, but someone got there before me. I found your answer very, very interesting. So I might just ask something else, if that's all right. I was thinking about this as you brought up the point earlier about facial features and the tracking that goes into those kinds of things. Like, do you think it's even too shallow to talk about, and I know that this is something that lies on the surface of a lot of these discussions, the dystopia of datification? And I say this in the context of a Twitter thread that I read maybe a year ago about a woman who works as a data scientist in the United States Department of Defense. And her function there was to use game theory to predict how humans run away from drones so that they could predict movement more accurately. And of course, things like that immediately, they summon up images of dystopia. And I kind of wonder, is that the end point of the renterism that you describe? Because you can only do those kind of analyses if you have millions and millions of hours of footage of people running and to try and predict how they run in different environments and stuff like that. So is that kind of where data renterism ends up in those kinds of places? I know that that gets into the militarization of data more than the welfarization of data, but I'd just be curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's, the thing about so Mark Andreevich is good on this relationship between militarism and, I mean, he actually says that we've had a sort of reverse between the marketing industry and the military, where it used to be sort of military ideas, I guess, sort of, or military technology migrated into marketing. And now we have the other way around, where sort of marketing ideas and technology increasingly shape how we think about sort of state violence and militaries as well. Does it lead to dystopia? I mean, I think that's, I think is actually, it assumes too passive, I suppose, a citizenship, those kinds of ideas in a way. And I do think, if we look at what's happening in terms of something like facial recognition is actually quite remarkable, some of the pushback that we've seen on that successfully. So, and that, I should say, a lot of that has been in the United States. But what's, I think, interesting about where that's come from in the United States is that it's come from community organizing often. So Black Lives Matter has been instrumental in the pushback against facial recognition by law enforcement in the United States. And that's something I think in the UK we could learn from. So one of the major challenges, and this is where the sort of data justice frame is kind of, I suppose, why we want to speak of it in those terms, is that we have an issue that any kind of pushback against digital technologies at the moment is dominated by digital rights groups, and particularly framed around data protection. And if we look at something like welfare, I think that's very limited because it doesn't actually necessarily talk about the power relations upon which this technology is, or within which technology is embedded. And that requires, I think, a different framing than thinking about digital rights or data protection. And what we actually need is much more of that kind of community organizing around this that is able to, I suppose, situate how these technologies have an impact in relation to, for example, social policy, and get a better understanding of that rather than make every issue a data rights issue. I think that's very limited. We need to talk about sort of social rights and economic rights still, and not necessarily accept this framing of it being a data rights issue. And then I think when you do that, I think there's much more effective pushback that allows us also to think about how do we then want welfare to be organized, for example, that isn't just about let's limit this, try and make this technology better or remove this technology for a moment, but actually rethink how we want the system to work, how we want society to be, right? So I think there are, I wouldn't accept the dystopian frame entirely, because I think we see on the ground actually reality is different than that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The hand wringing and powerlessness of that. There's no way through that. But through, I think, education, literacy, but also incorporating data practices, into regular kind of methods. Like when I first encountered. Like an algorithm kind of walked into my field, and I kind of ignored it for a while until, I couldn't ignore it any longer. And, I never wanted to study algorithms, but I end up finding myself studying them. And it's really, because of their power and agency in what they do. I think Pat has his hand up again, and we're kind of into the final few minutes. So if there's any kind of questions or comments, if people want to chime in, but we should be finishing at around 5, which is very family friendly.
Yeah, hopefully this is a quick one. So I just was really interested in your section on renterism and your ideas about that. I wonder if you just say a little bit about how you see data. You say at one point, I think that data is both commodity and capital. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's, so I draw there from Jason Sadowski, who's written an article on data as capital, which I would recommend reading for
on the list.
Yeah, but I think maybe, but I think the idea is here to think about the idea that it's not simply about trading goods, but actually changing practices, so that actually having data is valuable in itself, not always because you can turn it into profit, but actually because it's also allows you for forms of control, but also to optimize systems, to I think Sadowski lists a number of different power essentially that's associated with data as capital. And I think it's an important way of shifting the discussion because what it means is also there'll be a drive to turn more and more of our social practices into data. So in order to feed into this kind of I guess platform model really, and to make sure that it always scales. So there'll be this kind of, and this is why he talks about sort of the perpetual sort of generation of data is going to be part of this regime essentially. So that means that we need to think about these platforms, and this is where this software service model is really important, that it isn't just a one-off. It's about changing more and more practices. It's reconfiguring practices that are conducive to the logics of a platform. And that's where I think is a more complex understanding of data than, for example, in Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, which is very much thinking about data as a commodity that gets traded for profit. But actually here we're thinking about it as propelling new ways of doing business and governance.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's great.
Okay. Yeah, we'll Tina is asking for the name of the author for Data as Capital.
Yeah, Sadowski.
I know, a challenge for us all to as well. Oh, well done. So I think Tom has a question, but maybe just before, and we might take this as the last question. I suppose to circle back to one of the things we talked about earlier. I know we're jumping around, but there's so many fascinating areas in this. I was kind of minded when you were talking, and when Tom was asking about how we perform data. That's what I thought Adrienne was going to bring up, her work on looking at how people are asked to account for their marriage status on forms, and how that is often the first time people have had to explain how they've coupled up or not, or and put status on it. But sorry, just a comment, and I'll pass it over to Tom if you're there.
I said I had two questions earlier, and to an extent Zach already addressed this, but I suppose it's the problem of the framing and the storying of all of this. There's the dystopian frame, there's the absurdities of systems that don't connect to people, and square pegs and round holes and all of that. Another one is the Faustian frame, something like, we build a machine and then the machine takes us over, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's equally something that we have to beware of, this idea of that we create the machines and they control us, because it's so disabling, and also it doesn't get into the weeds of or the actual power relations involved, which is the renterism. So I don't know if there's a question left in that. It's more like a praise of your sort of work rather than Faustian accounts, but maybe you can.
Yeah. I think you made that exactly the point that we need to make sure that we remember to pinpoint power, because that gets lost also when we talk about, I guess, broad architectures of technology or machines that control life, that we lose then sight of, what are the enabling conditions of that? What is it that allows for that, and who are the actors involved in that? And I think we need to sort of maintain that kind of understanding, and also how they relate to historical practices, historical conditions, that these are, machine isn't just plopped somewhere, they emerge out of particular, I think, social practices and conditions, and we need to keep that in mind. I mean, of course, all this kind of science and technology studies has obviously been very instrumental in making us think about this differently, right? That these technologies are shaped or socially shaped. They don't just exist from nowhere. So I think we should always I think keep that in mind. But I just wanted maybe just so to end on because in terms of thinking about framings and why that's important. So and as it speaks to the point that Ray made about that our knee-jerk response to a lot of this stuff is to think about eliminating bias or tweaking the technology to make it better, as it were, to make it more fair. And I really think that that is a real battleground, like how we understand the kind of framing. So this, what is at stake, is very, at the moment, a very political question, because there is an active attempt, particularly by industry, I would say, to neutralize the discussion into precisely those kinds of questions. So industry is very happy for us to be having a discussion about bias, about fairness, etc., because these are things that they can contend with, and it doesn't necessarily question whether they should exist at all. It questions simply how to handle their technology better, or to fiddle with their technology in a way that we're more comfortable with it. So I think it's really important that just as much as we talk about or analyze what these technologies are doing, is also to think about how is resistance or concerns about them framed. Because both of those things are, I think, actually quite political questions.
Absolutely, yeah. Like particularly as government is now following the big tech companies through the door.
Yeah.
And we see the what's happening in Google's ethics department, and the way kind of companies like Plantier as well are kind of in this invidious space between the state and citizens.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was just speaking, so someone from the, used to work for the European Network Against Racism was saying, you know, when you go to government policy now and talk about some of the problems around these technologies, it's almost exclusively framed around bias in this. And so that discrimination is understood really as a technological problem, as a thing that can be also therefore technologically fixed. And that's the sort of thing that happens when we start framing issues in these kind of very neutral or sort of, I suppose, problematic ways or limited ways. Yeah.
Okay, wow. Well, thanks a million for unbundling so many things today, and thanks everybody for chiming in. I think we had a really, really good conversation with lots of voices on the call today. So just a reminder that we have Evelyn Brodkin, Mary Murphy and Joe Whelan on next Tuesday. So we'll all go and cook our dinners in our kitchens, which are presumably nearby. So thank you very much. Thanks,
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks.